In a place where the western wind blows through the barren hills, a man who has lived alone for many years suddenly buys a wife that the whole world has turned its back on, a woman with a scarred face that no one has the courage to look at for long. But the moment she steps down from the carriage, his heart feels like it is being squeezed, not because of fear, but because he realizes he is facing the hardest choice of his life. If it were you, would you dare to open the door of a house that has been silent for too long? Would you have the courage to reach out to someone with a painful past when you yourself have not yet healed your own loss? And in a society full of prejudice, what would keep you there? The fear of judgment, or the kindness that your heart whispers? Sometimes, what people need is not pity, but someone who dares to stand by them. If you have ever chosen silence because of pain, or have been afraid to love again, this story might be for you. Please like, share, and subscribe to the channel to join me on this very human healing journey. That morning, the wind blew down the valley from the Absaroka Mountains in a way only those who have spent a Wyoming winter truly understand. It was sharp as a knife, cutting through thick flannel shirts, creeping up the collars of leather jackets, making anyone standing on the porch hunker down. But Thomas Braddock stood there. His high boots were caked with frost, his old wide-brimmed hat tilted to one side to block the wind. He stood still, as if the wind could not move a man who had lived more than half his life in this harsh land. In Thomas's hand was an old silver pocket watch. The minute hand had just moved to 40, and he sighed. Stagecoach was already 40 minutes late. He wasn't impatient, nor was he worried. He was confused. Such feelings were rare for a man accustomed to living alone on 1,500 acres of dry land, to dealing with long, frustrating winters and cattle that required steely patience. But what he was about to do today was different. It touched a soft spot in him, a part he had tried to bury for the past 10 years. He was picking up a wife he had never met, a woman whom Prairie Matrimony Agency blandly called a profile candidate. A woman no one would accept, according to the agent. A woman with a special situation. Thomas didn't ask what special meant, partly because he didn't want to seem curious, partly because he figured life, in some way, dealt everyone its own sadness, and he had no right to judge anyone's sadness. The wind picked up again. In the distance, the clop-clop of hooves sounded. Thomas looked up and saw the old brown stagecoach slowly making its way over the rocky road. The wheels sank into the snow nearly 8 inches deep, making it sway. The road to his ranch was never easy, especially in winter, but today it seemed more severe than usual. The cart stopped in front of a wooden gate nearly 6 feet high. The driver, a thin man with a long gray beard, turned to look down at Thomas. "Braddock, here's your stuff," he said in his gruff, Midwestern voice that didn't bother to embellish his sentences. The stagecoach door opened. A woman got out, small, quiet, and a scarf that covers most of her face. She wore a long gray dress, a thick snow-covered coat, and worn leather gloves. Her hands clutched a small wooden suitcase, as if it contained only the few possessions of her life. She stopped in front of Thomas. The wind was blowing her robes, but her eyes, the only eyes Thomas could see clearly through the veil, were strangely calm. "You are Thomas Braddock, are you not?" Her voice was low, soft, and unwavering. A voice accustomed to facing the difficult. Thomas nodded. "Yes. And you are?" She raised her hand and slowly removed the towel wrapped around her face. And at that moment, Thomas stood still. Not out of fear, not out of disgust, but because he had never seen a wound with so many stories. The left side of her face was completely destroyed. The skin was stretched, covered in scars, and part of her cheekbone seemed to have been pulled down. Her left eye was cloudy, no longer shining. The skin had been severely damaged by acid or some other terrible accident. The scar stretched down to her neck, like a cut that time would never cover. The rest of her face was the complete opposite, graceful, proud, and even beautiful, in a gentle, calm way. 2 halves of a life. One half is pain. The other half is the strength to stand firm after the pain. "I am Lydia Harrow," she said calmly. as if accustomed to such a reaction. Then, in a voice neither high nor low, neither trembling nor sad, she continued, "If you want to cancel the deal, I can turn the car around immediately." "I understand that." Thomas opened his mouth, but no words came out. The wind picked up, making snow cling to his shoulders. A few seconds passed in silence. A few seconds long enough for Lydia to understand the way only those who had been rejected too many times understood. She tightened her grip on her suitcase and turned as if ready to get back into the car. But then Thomas spoke. Not loudly, not quickly. Just the voice of a man who has learned that sometimes silence can hurt. "No," he said. "I didn't cancel anything. I gave my word, and I keep it." Lydia stopped. She didn't turn, but her breathing hitched. Thomas walked over and picked up the surprisingly light suitcase. "Welcome to Braddock Ranch, Mrs. Harrow." For the first time, Lydia looked straight at him. Her right eye was bright and clear like an autumn lake. "Thank you," she said. "I don't expect people to keep their promises to me anymore." Thomas didn't answer right away, but something in his heart skipped a beat like the sound of an old wooden door opening, creaking softly but warmly. He turned to the driver and said, "Thank you. The road is bad today." The coachman smiled faintly. "Yeah, but it's not as bad as having to send 3 other women back because they changed their minds. Good luck." The car drove off, leaving a trail of wind and snow. Thomas watched for a moment, then turned back to Lydia. "The road to the house is a bit slippery. Be careful." Lydia nodded. She walked slowly, each step sure, as if she were used to people watching her, used to no one catching her arm when she wobbled. Thomas walked beside her, occasionally turning slightly to shield her from the wind. Though neither of them spoke, there was something about the space between them that wasn't quite as cold as it had been at the beginning. As Lydia stepped onto the porch, she looked up at the large, dark house. Thomas opened the door and bowed slightly, inviting her in. Inside, the largest room was heated by a cast-iron stove in the center of the house, but the heat was still lacking because of the night's heavy snowstorm. In the dim light, Lydia looked around. A house with thick wooden walls, a long oak table, old, reupholstered chairs, and windows that looked out onto a wide, snowy field. Not pretty, not fancy, but there was something warm about it, a warmth that had been long untouched. Thomas put the suitcase on the floor. "Just get used to this place. If you need anything, just let me know." Lydia clasped her hands together, a habit she had when she wanted to keep her composure. "Mr. Braddock," she said softly, "I don't expect much. Just tell me what I have to do." Thomas frowned slightly. "There's nothing you have to do. First of all, you're here. That's enough." Lydia bowed her head ever so slightly, not in submission, but because it touched something she had lacked for years, a little respect. In a large house, in the middle of a cold Wyoming winter, 2 people stood across from each other, each carrying half of a life torn apart. But in that moment, however fleeting, something like warmth rose in the silence. A beginning, fragile, quiet, but maybe enough for something bigger. There was a kind of silence in Braddock Ranch in the afternoons. Not an ominous silence, but a blanket so thick it covered the land that people were little more than dots between the sky and the snow. The afternoon Lydia arrived was no different. The sunlight slanted down through the gnarled cottonwood trees, painting pale gold streaks across the snow, making the whole space seem to hold its breath as it watched 2 people struggling to find their place in each other's lives. Thomas lifted the lid of the kettle on the stove, checking to see if the water was hot enough for coffee. He was not used to having guests, and even less used to having a new wife. His heart, which had been locked away since Mary's death 10 years ago, was now clenching slightly in a way that made him feel awkward. He had never thought that at the age of 52 he would one day be standing in the kitchen, making coffee for a strange woman. Lydia stood a few steps away, her hands still clasped in front of her, her eyes carefully surveying the house. She looked around as if trying to memorize every detail, afraid that any movement would upset the order of the house she was about to live in. Her wounded face did not hide the tension, but her good eyes shone with determination. a small person with the fortitude of someone who had lived through too many storms. It took Thomas a few seconds to realize that Lydia was standing too straight, too reserved, as if she were afraid of disturbing the atmosphere in the house. "You, just sit," he said, his voice a little hoarser than usual. "Don't stand." Lydia started slightly, then nodded. She walked slowly to the wooden chair by the window. As she sat down, she placed her hands in her lap, holding them still, as if awaiting instructions. Thomas poured 2 cups of black coffee, the same one he had had every day since Mary died. When he placed the cups in front of Lydia, she bowed her head in thanks, her voice so low it almost lost its voice to the wind coming through the crack in the door. "This coffee is a little strong," Thomas said, sitting down on the other side of the table. "If you don't like it, I'll add sugar." Lydia shook her head. "I'm used to it. I used to drink it too." Thomas was a little stunned. "Before? When?" She hesitated a moment. "When I was a nurse, during the Civil War." Thomas set down his glass, his eyes widening a little. He hadn't expected her to have served in the war. That explained the cold calm in her voice, the firmness in her movements, and the wounds so deep that time could not heal them. He was about to ask more, but Lydia looked out the window, where the strong wind was whipping up small clumps of snow like white dust. "I apologize," she said. "If my presence makes you uncomfortable." Thomas frowned. "Awkward?" "No, Mrs. Harrow. It's just, I'm not used to strangers in the house." Lydia pursed her lips and nodded. "I understand." There was a long silence, but not an uncomfortable one. Just 2 old people trying to figure out how to touch each other's lives without hurting each other. Thomas stood up after a few sips of coffee and said, "I'll show you around the house, let you know where things are." Lydia followed him up the wooden stairs to the 2nd floor. Thomas's boots echoed softly on the floor, steady as the heartbeat of a man who had lived his whole life in the natural discipline of the West. "This is the main room." Thomas opened the door, revealing a large room with a large bed and clean sheets, and a window overlooking the endless fields. "If you want it, it's yours." Lydia looked not at the bed, but at the open space to the west, where the sun was low, its pale orange light filtering through the dusty glass. "This room is nice," she said softly. "But I think I should have the little room off the kitchen." Thomas turned to look at her as if he didn't understand. "That room is too small. There's no air." "I am used to small rooms," Lydia replied. "It is easier to clean, and I did not want to bother you." "What a bother." His voice was a little harsh, but it was the harshness of confusion, not anger. Lydia looked at him a long time. Her eyes were kind but tired. "Mr. Braddock, I was sent back 3 times before I came here. I don't want to be blamed for taking too much." The whole sentence was like a sharp knife, silent but stabbing straight into Thomas's chest. He didn't know what to say. No words were gentle enough to repair the hurt spoken in the achingly calm tone. Finally, he just nodded. "As you wish." They went back downstairs. Thomas took out a kerosene lamp and opened the door to the small room next to the kitchen. The room was only about 8 feet by 10 feet. Small bed, low wooden table, no decoration except for a small square window next to the sink. Lydia placed her hand on the edge of the bed. The way she touched it was as if she was just checking to make sure this wasn't a dream. "I'm grateful," she said softly. "Not everyone gives me a place to be safe." Thomas wanted to tell her she didn't need to be grateful for what she deserved, but the words died when he saw the scar that stretched from her temple to her neck. He didn't want to show pity. She deserved respect, not cheap pity. "You should get some rest," Thomas said. "I'll make some soup for dinner. It's cold here." "You need to keep warm." Lydia nodded. "I won't bother you." Thomas frowned slightly. "Here, no one bothers anyone." He walked out, but before he closed the door, Lydia called after him, "Mr. Braddock." He turned his head. "Thank you for not changing your mind." Her voice was as soft as the sound of falling snow on the porch. But in those words was a life of being used to rejection. Thomas didn't reply. He just bowed his head and walked out of the small room, letting the door close behind him. And in that moment, Thomas realized something strange. The house, which had been silent for 10 years, suddenly felt different, not warmer, not happier, but like the first heartbeat after what seemed like a long time since part of it had died. He went into the kitchen and threw more wood into the stove. The fire flared up, orange light illuminating the old walls. He stood still for a few seconds in front of the flames. A woman with half her face destroyed just said thank you for not changing your mind. The truth made his chest ache. A strange ache, as if awakening something that had been dormant in him for too long. Night fell. The wind whistled through the roof. And Thomas Braddock knew that his life had turned a new page. For better or for worse, he did not know. But it was certainly not as quiet as it had been 10 years before. Mornings always started early at Braddock Ranch. The sky was barely light. Breath was already steaming white, and the ground was so frozen that every step made a crunching sound. But on Lydia's first morning there, Thomas noticed something different. He had barely left the bedroom when he heard a faint sound from the kitchen. It was not a hurried clatter, nor a frightened step. It was steady, slow, careful, like the sound of someone accustomed to making every effort to live his life to the fullest. Thomas paused for a few seconds before moving on. Lydia was standing by the sink, the light from the oil lamp on the table falling on her face, dividing it between shadow and light. She had tied her hair back, was wearing the old sweater she had folded in her suitcase the day before, and was gently wiping the counter, each movement slow and orderly. He didn't know why, but the sight warmed his heart in a very vague way. "You're up early," Thomas said, tapping the doorframe to announce his approach. Lydia turned back. Half her face, deeply scarred, looked harsh in the light, but the other half was calm and gentle. "I'm used to it," she said. "I don't want to bother you with the noise." "Here," Thomas stepped closer. "There's no bothering anyone." Lydia bowed her head. "I will remember that." There were a few moments of silence before Lydia spoke up. "I see you don't have much food in the kitchen. If you want, I can prepare a list to buy more." Thomas scratched his chin, a habit he had when he was thinking. "I usually only buy what I need. Being alone, I don't need to be picky." Lydia looked at him as if weighing his words. She didn't comment, just nodded and went back to wiping the pot. Thomas stood there, watching her shadow against the wooden wall, feeling something in the house thicken, no longer empty. Even his breathing slowed to the calm rhythm of the woman quietly reorganizing her life in an unfamiliar kitchen. After breakfast, Thomas donned his leather jacket, a woolen scarf, and thick gloves, and stepped out into the yard. The cold air stung his face, sharp enough to sting his eyes. It was a morning like any other in the West. Windy, lonely, and full of the smell of ice. "Do you need any help?" Lydia's voice came from behind. Thomas turned and saw her standing not far from the door, clutching the edge of her coat for warmth. He shook his head. "Thank you. It's a lot of work out here. You'd better stay inside." Lydia almost wanted to say she was used to heavy lifting, but she stopped. There was something in Thomas's eyes, not pity, but calm respect, that made her reluctant to refuse. She just nodded. Then, "I will clean the house a little more." Thomas turned away, but there was a strange feeling in his heart, a little joy, a little guilt, and a little confusion that he couldn't name. It was midday when Thomas returned from checking the 3-mile-long fence that surrounded the farm. He entered the house with muddy gloves and snow-packed boots, but it wasn't the cold outside that stopped him, it was the sight before him. The house changes. The table was dust-free. The curtains were ruffled and neatly hung. The fogged windows were clear. The great room, once dusty and silent, now looked like someone would want to live there. Lydia stood by the fireplace, her skirts brushing the wood floor. She used a small cloth to wipe the dust from the tabletop. The sunlight from the east window softened the scars on her face. Thomas stood there for almost a minute without Lydia noticing. He rarely felt self-conscious, but the moment made him instinctively smooth the brim of his hat. "You work so much. You must be tired. Lydia jumped and turned, still clutching the rag. I'm used to cleaning. In the places I've lived, no one did it for me. I don't want you to do it all yourself, Thomas said, his voice lower than usual. I didn't hire you to do the work. Lydia shook her head. Not for hire. But I feel good cleaning. The house is cold. I think it would be more comfortable for you if you tidied it up a bit. Thomas stood still, his heart sinking in a way he couldn't quite describe. Not sadness, not exactly joy. Like a man accustomed to emptiness suddenly feels a hand touch the empty space inside him lightly, but enough to make him stop. Thank you, said Thomas. Really. Lydia bowed her head, but said nothing. That afternoon, Sheriff Cole Harding came to visit. Cole was an old friend of Thomas's, tall and thin, in faded riding jeans and a heavy western coat. As soon as he entered, Cole looked around the house and whistled. Good heavens, Thomas. Have I got the wrong house? This place is much cleaner than it was 3 months ago. Thomas coughed slightly. Someone new is rearranging. Cole raised an eyebrow. Your new wife? Before Thomas could answer, Lydia emerged from the kitchen, a folded towel in her hand. She stopped when she saw the stranger. Cole touched his hat brim with Western courtesy. Good evening, Mrs. Harrow. I am Cole Harding, sheriff of this area. Lydia nodded. My pleasure. Cole looked at her, then back at Thomas with a knowing look, but he said nothing. Western men had a certain kind of respect, not asking too much when something had not been shared. After a few stories about the weather and the town, Cole pulled Thomas out onto the porch. You know, Cole said softly, Red Willow has been a bit wordy lately. Nathaniel has been saying some nasty things too. Thomas clenched his jaw. Let him say what he wants. Thomas, you have been my friend for a long time. I know you are a man of your word. But don't let them use their evil mouths to hurt your wife, especially one who has suffered so many wounds. Thomas was silent. Don't let her silence be the reason she thinks you're not on her side, Cole continued. Thomas bowed his head, his fingers absent-mindedly brushing the edge of his cap. The words touched a chord of hesitation that had been hidden in his mind all morning. Lydia had lost faith in life too many times, and he, with his Western manly toughness, didn't know how to start the conversation. Late afternoon. The sky was orange and red, streaking across the snowy fields. Lydia was folding dry towels when Thomas entered. She looked up, her eyes filled with familiar reserve. Tomorrow, said Thomas, we need to go to town, buy some things. Lydia paused. Are you sure? I don't want to attract attention. Nobody bothers anyone here. Thomas repeated his words from the morning, but this time his voice was deeper and firmer. Lydia looked at him for a long time, then nodded slightly. In the fading light, Lydia's right eye glowed a warm red, while the scarred half of her face remained in shadow. The two halves, like the two parts of her life, were still learning to stand side by side. And Thomas, in that moment, realized that perhaps the hardest thing was not living with someone, but letting someone know that he wanted them to stay. The next morning, the sun was just rising over the mountains, its rays cutting through the silver mist like razor blades. The wind was less bitter than yesterday, but still carried the 20 degrees Fahrenheit chill typical of early Wyoming winter. Thomas saddled the tall, dark brown horse, and Lydia stood on the steps, pulling her woolen scarf tight around her neck. Today was her first time going into town with Thomas, and, somehow, she felt nervous, something she rarely let on. Thomas walked up to her, still holding the reins. It's a rough ride. Tell me if you get tired. Lydia nodded, saying nothing. When Thomas reached out to help her into the carriage, Lydia flinched slightly. She wasn't used to anyone touching her, especially a man. Thomas noticed this, so he withdrew his hand and said softly, You go first. I'll keep the car safe. The way he said it, no pressure, no pity, made Lydia feel a little better. She climbed into the old wagon, her scarf fluttering in the wind. Thomas slid into the seat beside them, A light crack of the whip sounded, and the horse began to walk steadily. The road to Red Willow was nearly 5 miles long, across vast, snow-covered fields, where the low sun cast long shadows like two solitary figures against a white background. She didn't ask anything. He didn't speak, but there was a warmer silence between them than the previous days. The silence of two people trying to find a common breath. The town of Red Willow came into view after nearly an hour. It was small, with only about a dozen wooden houses, a tavern, a general store, a white-walled church, and a sheriff's office. Though small, movement was evident from a distance: horse-drawn carriages, a few people hurrying to avoid the wind, a dog running across the road. Thomas pulled on the reins to slow the horse down. "You need not be afraid," he said softly. "I'm not scared," Lydia replied quickly, almost reflexively. But then she clenched her handkerchief, her hands shaking slightly. The moment they entered Red Willow, eyes turned towards them, or rather, towards Lydia. Lydia felt it very clearly. The words were slow and low, but loud enough for her to hear. "Who is that?" "It's Braddock's new wife." My God, her face. Lydia lowered her head even more. Even though she had gotten used to such gazes over the years, it still hurt just as much. As if every time someone looked at her, the old burn became hotter. Thomas walked beside her, his shoulders tense. He was not a meddlesome man, but he knew the atmosphere was cutting into the woman with him. He just didn't know what to do to cover up those cuts. As she entered the grocery store, a bell above the door jingled. The proprietress, a woman in her 60s named Mabel, looked Lydia up and down. A polite smile stretched across only one side of her mouth. "Braddock. You brought someone new this time?" Thomas nodded, his voice calm. "This is Lydia Harrow." "Ah," Mrs. Mabel drawled. "Hello." Lydia replied softly, "With pleasure." But soon a few whispers arose behind them. Wives, old people, or idle gossipers around town. "Poor thing. I wonder why Braddock took her in. Maybe it was out of pity." Lydia stood still, her hands clutching the edges of her shawl. She didn't turn, she didn't run, she didn't cover her face, all the things she had done so many years ago. Now, she just stood there, letting the words pass by like the wind through the walls. But standing still does not mean no pain. Thomas listened to every word. He wanted to say something, to shut them up, to cover Lydia like a wound that had not yet healed, but his lips only pressed together. He swallowed his anger down his chest like hot ashes. Lydia noticed the silence. She didn't blame him, she understood. But a small rift appeared inside her. She'd carried such rifts for half her life. Every time someone fell silent, they deepened. As they stepped out of the shop, a man's voice rang out from the tavern porch across the street. Braddock. His voice was deep, wide, and full of the arrogance of those accustomed to standing above others. Thomas turned back. So did Lydia. That's Nathaniel Rhodes. Tall, about 55, was the richest man in the area, with a large ranch and hundreds of head of cattle. He leaned against a wooden post, his black hat pulled low, his pale blue eyes fixed on Lydia, as if examining a defective product. "Your new wife?" Nathaniel smiled. "I thought you would choose someone. I didn't think you would choose someone that even the agency couldn't find anyone to take on." The words are like a sharp knife. Lydia stood up straight, her lips pressed together, but her eyes did not waver. Nathaniel looked at her, tilting his head slightly. "That's brave. Coming down the mountain without a veil. Not many people know you here." Thomas took a half step forward. "Nathaniel, that's enough." "Oh?" Nathaniel raised an eyebrow. "I was just being reasonable. There aren't many Red Willow men as generous as you." His voice was like mocking kindness and then turning it into a joke. Thomas knew he was being tested. He was used to Nathaniel challenging him on matters of land and business. But today, it was the woman standing silently beside him who faced him. Lydia looked at Thomas. There was no blame or resentment in her gaze, just a silent question. "Do you find me worth protecting?" Thomas opened his mouth, just for a moment. But all that came out was, "Let's go home." Lydia nodded. Nathaniel laughed. "Well, go on. No one here wants to scare her further." His laughter pierced the cold air, leaving behind an unpleasant tone. Thomas clenched his fists, but didn't turn around. Lydia quickened her pace, as if she just wanted to get out of there. On the way back, the wind blew hard, but it wasn't as cold as the air in the car. Thomas held the reins tightly. Lydia stared straight ahead, her eyes unmoving. Her face was so calm that it was impossible to tell what she was thinking. After a long while, Thomas spoke up. "I am sorry for what they said." His voice was low, as if pulled by the weight of something he was holding in his chest. Lydia didn't turn around. "He didn't say those words, but I was standing still." Lydia closed her eyes slightly. A slow breath escaped. "Mr. Braddock, silence is sometimes the best thing a man can do. I don't blame him. People are not used to defending what they don't understand." Thomas turned to look at her, but Lydia kept her eyes on the snowy field. "But," Lydia continued, "that's why people like me always have to learn to stand alone." A light sentence, but it sounds like a sadness that has lived too long in the heart. Thomas didn't know how to respond. The cold outside stung his cheeks, but the real pain was in his chest. A pain that made him wonder if his silence was another stab Lydia had to endure. When the car arrived at the ranch, Lydia got out first. She said softly, "Thank you for taking me." Then she walked into the house, not in a hurry, not trembling, just silently. Thomas stood by the car, watching the wooden door gently close. And for the first time since meeting Lydia, he felt something distinct. There were wounds that weren't just skin deep, and he had just accidentally touched one of them. The next morning, the sun shone. A weak, thin light, like an old scarf, but enough to melt the snow of the night before into sparkling streaks along the porch. The air was quieter, so quiet that the sighs of the wood in the cracks of the walls could be heard. Thomas woke earlier than usual, partly because ranch work never allowed him to sleep in. But this morning there was another reason. He couldn't shake the image of Lydia in the wagon from yesterday, her face staring straight ahead, uncomplaining, but filled with a weariness he knew he shared. He put on his coat and walked out of the room. And like most mornings recently, Lydia was in the kitchen. She stood by the small window, rinsing rice in an old cast-iron pot. The cream curtains were drawn aside, letting the sunlight fall on the good side of her face, making it shine brightly. The scarred side was in shadow, always there, needing no explanation, no concealment. Thomas stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her small, sturdy figure. A strange feeling passed through him, not pity, not admiration, more like recognition that her presence made the house feel less empty. "She got up early," Thomas said, his voice so soft he didn't think it came from him. Lydia turned around, a little surprised but not confused. "I'm used to it. The wind was blowing hard last night, and I didn't get much sleep." "That's the west wind," Thomas replied. "It blows like it's going to tear the roof off." Lydia glanced out the window. "I was in Missouri. The wind was different, a little cold, but damp. The wind here, it bites into your skin." Thomas chuckled. "Yeah, that's right." There were a few seconds of peaceful silence. It was no longer as awkward as the first few days, but not exactly comfortable either. It was just the silence of two people who were no longer strangers, but still gave each other a small space to breathe. After breakfast, Thomas went out to the stables. The ranch was always busy this time of year. Checking fences, herding cattle, cleaning water troughs. He led his old horse, Oak, out of the stable and began examining the cracks in the north fence. Meanwhile, in the distance, Lydia hung the washed towels to dry. She straightened each wooden peg, adjusted each corner of the fabric. A series of small, very small tasks, but done with the care only one who has lived alone knows. Thomas observed unconsciously, and realized that the house was gradually filled with the scent of people. A calm, gentle, not noisy, but enough to make him feel like he was no longer walking alone in that vast place. Not long after, Thomas heard light footsteps behind him. He turned around. Lydia stood there in a brown sweater, clutching a scarf. She bowed slightly when she saw him looking. I brought some warm water for you to wash your hands." Thomas paused. Few people paid attention to such small things. Mary did that when he came in from work. An old memory flashed before him, then vanished in the wind. He took the towel and nodded. "Thank you." Lydia smiled slightly, a small smile, just a slight lift of the corners of her lips, but enough to light up the good side of her face. It made Thomas look away involuntarily, as if he had just seen something precious he couldn't hold on to for long. After a few hours of yard work, Thomas returned home. Lydia had finished cleaning the house, and it was so clean that it felt strange to Thomas, as if he were living in a better version of the house he had grown accustomed to. A slight noise from the kitchen made him enter. Lydia was washing onions, her eyes focused, her body tilted slightly. She didn't hear him, or pretended not to. Thomas stood still for a few seconds, then spoke. "You don't have to do everything. I'm used to taking care of myself." Lydia stopped, the juice from the onion dripping into the sink. "I know," she said. "But I feel better doing something about this house." Thomas sat down in a chair at the kitchen table, his eyes lingering on her hands with calluses and bruises, the marks of a life that had not been easy. "You work so much. Aren't you tired?" "It gets tiring." Lydia smiled slightly. Thomas understood. A life of prying eyes, of malicious whispers. One could get used to physical pain. But the pain of being seen as undeserved was hard. He touched the wooden table and asked a question that surprised even himself. "Do you think it's okay for you here?" Lydia looked up. The sunlight caught her right eye, bright but deep. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "But I feel more at peace than I thought I would." Thomas nodded slightly. Something, just a little, dropped in his chest, like a stone falling from a long-worn bag. That afternoon, Lydia went out to the barn and brought Thomas a freshly folded scarf. He was trying to tie a loose piece of the gate rope. When Lydia came to him, the wind had pushed her scarf a little askew, revealing more scars down her neck. Thomas saw. But this time, he didn't turn away. It was no longer amazement or confusion. It was simply looking at the vestiges of a life that had suffered so much loss, and he saw in it a resilience worthy of respect. "I used to think I had no one to call home," Lydia said, as if talking to the wind. "But today, I feel like I have a place to stand." Thomas was silent, but it was not a silence of resignation. He wanted to say, "You can stay here as long as you want." He wanted to say, "I won't let anyone hurt you anymore." He wanted to say something enough to let her know that her presence was more important than she thought. But all he could say was, "It will be colder tomorrow. Remember to keep warm." A simple sentence. A sentence like countless sentences Western men often say. But to Lydia, it didn't sound like a polite phrase. It sounded like a promise. She nodded. "I know." The afternoon light fell, a warm, golden light, over them both. In the distance, the cattle were making their way home. The house behind them stood still, but no longer lonely. And Thomas, looking at Lydia from the side, realized something he had never thought of. Her silence made his own silence less heavy. They don't say it. It doesn't need to be said. But in that moment, in the middle of the vast ranch, in the cold air of the late day, two souls that had been eroded by loneliness and prejudice stood a very small distance closer to each other. That little piece, sometimes it's the beginning of something big. The afternoon was unusually overcast. Thick, iron-heavy clouds gathered over Wyoming. Thomas stood on the porch, looking north where billowing snowdrift spelled a violent storm coming down the valley. He entered the house and closed the door, the thick layer of snow blowing against the walls with a flat thump. Lydia was putting wood in a basket near the fireplace. She turned when she saw him. "Is it going to storm, Mr. Braddock?" "Yeah. It could last 2 or 3 days. Do you have enough warm clothes?" Thomas approached, looking at the thin scarf she was wearing. "I'm fine," Lydia replied, but even she knew the Wyoming wind didn't leave anyone fine for long. Thomas took Mary's old woolen coat from the closet. He meant to give it to her, but when his fingers touched the fabric, he stopped. Memories of Mary, her laugh, the smell of baking bread. Her small hands flooded like a wind. He closed his eyes for a split second, then opened them. "This one is warmer," he said, placing the coat on the chair near Lydia. She looked at the shirt, hesitant. "I don't want to take things from the dead." "You don't," Thomas replied, his voice low but matter-of-fact. "I just want you to wear it so you don't get cold." Lydia touched the shirt lightly. The gesture was small but filled with gratitude. "Thank you." A few minutes later, the wind began to howl outside the window. The storm swept over the valley like a cold blanket. In the small house, the storm outside created a low background, as if telling the story of the mountains. Lydia added more wood to the stove. The fire flared up, revealing every scar on her face, making it no longer scary but very real, very human. Thomas sat a few feet from the stove, using a small knife to trim the loose wood from the handle of his hoe. As he worked, his eyes occasionally glanced at Lydia. She moved quietly, carefully, like someone who must guard her every step so as not to cross the invisible boundary that life has erected around her. Lydia placed a cast-iron pot on the stove, and the smell of soup wafted out light, simple, like the smell of meals eaten by people who had spent years in harsh lands. "Would you like some soup?" Lydia asked. Thomas nodded. "You earn it." Lydia smiled a small, soft smile. It made Thomas turn away involuntarily, like someone unfamiliar with warmth. As the storm intensified, the windows rattled. They sat closer together, listening to the fire instead of the wind. Lydia opened a small book, one she had found in Thomas's box. A rather old volume of poetry, its pages yellowed. "Can I read?" To drown out the wind noise. Thomas tilted his head. He wasn't much of a poetry person, but he liked the sound of Lydia's voice, low, smooth, a little hoarse, like an old wooden guitar. "Just read it." Lydia opened the book and read a poem by Emily Dickinson. Her voice touched each word lightly, the sound blending with the crackle of the fire. Thomas couldn't understand every word, but he understood the feeling in her voice, lonely, yet hopeful, of someone who had overcome the darkness. When Lydia finished reading, the house was quiet for a while. "Do you like poetry?" Thomas asked. "I used to read to the kids in class," Lydia replied. "Before it happened." Thomas looked at the half-destroyed face. He asked slowly, his voice low, "The accident, how did it happen?" Lydia did not answer immediately. The storm outside howled loudly, as if tearing through the roof. Finally, she said, "I was protecting a little girl. A bad guy threw acid at her. I took it." She touched her scarred face. "I survived. She didn't." Thomas felt his chest tighten. Not from pity, but from the way her pain was spoken so lightly, as if she had been used to carrying it all her life. "I'm sorry," Thomas said. Lydia shook her head. "No need. Everyone has their losses." The words resonated deeply, touching on the years Thomas had lived with Mary's memory. He looked up, into Lydia's good eyes, eyes that did not flee. "You're stronger than you think," Thomas said softly. Lydia paused. A thin line of emotion passed through her. Perhaps she had not heard anyone say that in a long time. "Nobody usually says that," she whispered. The first night, they both stayed up late. The wind sounded like the earth's complaint, but in the small room, the fire cast a warm yellow shadow on the wall like a painting. Lydia slept on the chair next to the stove, her hand still resting on the half-open book of poetry. Thomas saw her nod, so he gently put his hand on her shoulder and called, "You should go back to your room. It's cold at night." But Lydia was already asleep. She had no strength left to keep her eyes open. The storm, the long days before, and a lifetime of running from prejudice, all had drained her. Thomas was at a loss. He didn't know whether to touch her, a woman with many wounds, both on her skin and inside. But then Thomas bent down and gently picked her up. Lydia was so light, it felt like he was carrying only a coat. As he carried her away, Lydia whispered something in her sleep. A small voice, like a name, but not clearly. Maybe a name from a painful memory. Maybe just a labored breath. Thomas laid Lydia down on the bed in the small room. He pulled the blanket over her shoulders, pulling it down gently so as not to touch the scarred skin. The oil lamplight made her eyelashes flutter, soft as falling snow. He stood looking for a moment, then turned off the light and walked out. The door closed, and in that moment, for some reason, Thomas felt his heart sink, a strange kind of sinking, as if he had just put down a pain that wasn't his. But somehow, it felt lighter. Day 2. The storm still hasn't stopped. Lydia woke up in the small room, but no longer felt like a spare person. She heard Thomas in the living room, the sound of chairs being pulled out, footsteps, the sound of him adding more wood. She put on the sweater he gave her and walked out. Thomas turned back. His eyes, though dark from being awake all night, lighted up slightly when he saw she was awake. "How are you feeling?" "I'm better," Lydia said, though her voice was still weak. "The storm is far from over," Thomas replied. "We'll probably just hang around the house today." Lydia nodded. "I know." Thomas turned to leave, but then remembered something. He looked at her for a few seconds before saying, "Yesterday, I carried you back to your room. I hope you don't mind." Lydia was stunned. No one had touched her in years, partly because she was shy, partly because others were. But Thomas meant it with a straight face, without any hidden meaning. "I don't mind," Lydia replied. "Thank you." And for the first time, as she said that, Lydia felt like she wasn't alone in the world. Small moments. But sometimes, small things like that are enough to break a very thick layer of ice in people's hearts. By the evening of the third day, the storm had begun to subside. Snow was still falling outside, but the wind had softened, as if nature were breathing down its anger. Lydia and Thomas sat near the fireplace. No poetry reading, no talking. Just sitting next to each other, letting the silence between them become something less scary. Lydia held a cup of hot tea and said softly, "I never thought that one day I would see peace in the storm." Thomas replied in a low but sincere voice, "Me too." The firelight reflected on their faces, one with an external wound, one with an internal wound, and in that silence, the storm passed. Not just the storm outside, but the storm inside them. After 3 days of storms, the Wyoming sky seemed to have washed clean. That morning, the sun rose slowly, like an old man lifting a heavy blanket from the ground. Snow lay everywhere, nearly a foot deep, reflecting light so brightly it made one squint. Thomas stepped out onto the porch, taking a deep breath as if to regain his strength from the stormy days. He looked around the vast ranch. The east fence was leaning. The barn roof was covered in snow. Some of the weatherboard had come loose from its nails. The work ahead was a mountain of stone, but the first thing he noticed wasn't the ranch. But it is Lydia. She stood a few feet from the porch, brushing snow from the railing with a small towel. She was still wearing the sweater he had given her that storm, a little loose, but surprisingly fitting. She looked up when she saw him. "You get up early." Thomas walked down the steps, his boots digging into the snow. "On this ranch," he said slowly, "anyone who gets up late loses the whole day." Lydia smiled slightly. "Then I'll try not to wake you up late." At that moment, Thomas felt his heart skip a beat. It wasn't the sudden fluttering of a young man, but a gentle flutter. As thin as ice under the sun, barely perceptible, yet incredibly real. After breakfast, Thomas took his toolbox out to repair the fence. Lydia stood in the doorway, her hand clutching the edge of her coat. "Can I help you?" she asked. "You stay inside. It's slippery out here." "I'm used to hard work," Lydia said, her eyes calm but her voice firm. Thomas paused for a moment. He was used to seeing Lydia doing small things, cleaning the kitchen, hanging towels, tidying the house, but he had never imagined she would stand beside him doing things like pulling wire, hammering nails, cleaning the stables. "Have you ever done heavy work?" "I did a lot of things," Lydia replied. "When a person lives alone, they have to learn everything." Thomas looked at her hands. Not soft, not slim. Small calluses, faint dark circles, the signs of someone who had lived for years without help. "Well, if you want to." "I won't stop you," Thomas said. Lydia nodded. And so the two of them got to work. They started at the east fence. The wire had been blown loose from the stakes by the wind. Lydia held the stakes straight while Thomas pulled the wire, tightening it with the pliers. Sometimes their hands brushed not intentionally, but each time they did, they both flinched. Thomas tried to concentrate, but the pine smell of Lydia's hair, the way her shoulders shook slightly under her old sweater, the way she didn't complain even as the snow soaked into her boots, all of it made him feel her presence in a way he hadn't before. At 52, Thomas knew he was not a man to be trifled with. He thought his heart had long since closed. But something about Lydia, her unyielding silence, her gentle toughness made the ice in his heart begin to crack. In contrast, Lydia was also observing Thomas. He was quiet. But the way he handed her the tools at the right time, the way he always stood to the side of the wind to shield her, and the way he observed without judgment, made her feel like she was not being scrutinized or judged like she had been in previous years. A strange feeling, almost safe. When she reached the last stake, Lydia stretched her arms, trying to hide her fatigue. "It was harder than I thought," she admitted. Thomas chuckled. He rarely laughed out loud. "I told you, ranch work isn't easy." Lydia leaned one hand against the wooden post. "But I like doing it. It helps me forget." Her eyes fell, a layer of memory covering them. "Forgot what?" Thomas asked, his voice almost a whisper. Lydia replied slowly, her eyes looking at the distant fields. "Forget about being told I'm not worthy to stand next to anyone." A difficult sentence to touch, but she said it very lightly, as if it had been buried in her heart for too long and now released for the wind to carry away. Thomas put down the pliers and turned to look at her. "Lydia," he said softly for the first time, "no one has the right to say you're not worthy." Lydia turned back. Her right eye was glistening with slight surprise. "You don't need to say that to make me feel better." "I don't say it to be nice," Thomas replied. "I say it because it's true." At that moment, the snow stopped falling. Neither of them knew what had just changed, but they both felt it. As evening fell, Lydia began making dinner. The smell of stewed potatoes and onions filled the house, warming the room noticeably. Thomas sat by the window, carving a piece of wood with a knife, a habit that helped him think. Lydia stole a few glances at him. There was something about the man's demeanor that made her feel peaceful. A kind of peace she thought she would never have the chance to feel again. When dinner was over, the two of them sat down to eat. They didn't say much, but the distance between them was gone. Sometimes they would look at each other and then look away, as if afraid the other would read something they shouldn't have said. After dinner, Lydia cleared the table. Thomas helped wash the dishes, even though he was clumsy. "The water is too warm," Thomas said as his hands turned red from the heat. "Let me do it." Lydia stepped back. "It's okay. I'm used to it." They stood side by side, their hands touching again. This time, Lydia did not flinch. Thomas did not pull away. Night fell. Lydia sat on the porch, wrapped in a woolen scarf, looking out at the snow-covered fields, the moonlight reflecting off them in a thin layer of light. The wind was lighter, not howling like it had been on stormy days. Thomas came out carrying 2 cups of hot tea. He placed one in front of her and sat down. They did not speak for a long time. "It's beautiful," said Lydia. "Yes," Thomas replied, "but beautiful in a lonely way." Lydia smiled. "Don't you like being alone?" Thomas sighed. "There was a time when I thought being alone was the safest thing." "For Mary?" Lydia asked softly. Thomas was stunned. No one had spoken directly about Mary since Lydia arrived, but Lydia had heard a few things Sheriff Cole had said and had seen Thomas look at the old wooden box containing Mary's things a few times. "Because I'm afraid of losing more," Thomas replied honestly. "When someone loses the thing they love most, they think, not loving anymore will ease the pain." "But is it true?" Lydia asked. Thomas did not answer immediately. He looked at the snow, which shone like a lake in the moonlight. "No. Just die more slowly." Lydia tilted her head to look at him. The words touched a personal pain, the pain of being alive, of being looked at with pity, of being isolated by mean words. "He's not dead," Lydia whispered. "He just slept too long." Thomas chuckled. The first time it wasn't bitter. Maybe so. The spring breeze began to blow in, albeit weakly. The sound of the wind and their breathing blended together, creating a silence that was no longer heavy but felt like new ground for something to sprout. Lydia looked into her teacup, her voice almost whispering. "Mr. Braddock, if I bother you one day, just say so. I won't stay if you find it difficult." Thomas turned around and looked straight at her. "Lydia, you don't bother me." Lydia's eyes widened slightly, as if she couldn't believe her ears. Thomas continued, his voice low. "Truly, I'm only afraid of one thing." "What?" Lydia asked. "I'm afraid you'll leave before I get to know you well enough." No wind, no sound, just the two of them, in the silvery night, looking at each other as if the whole vast West had shrunk into this moment. That night, when Lydia returned to her room, she put her hand to her chest. Her heart was not beating as fast as a young person's, but it was beating clearly enough that she could hear it. Something was changing, something she both hoped for and feared, because love, for someone as wounded as Lydia, is not easy. It's like stepping onto the ice in early spring, beautiful, but fragile. Thomas, in the next room, sat by the window until late at night. He wondered, am I betraying Mary? Will she be sad if she knows I want to live? But then he remembered Lydia's words. You just slept too long. And for the first time in years, he thought, maybe Mary wanted him to wake up too. After that quiet moonlit night, the days at Braddock Ranch passed at a more leisurely pace. Thomas found himself breathing easier as he entered the house, and Lydia opened up a little more, though there was still a wariness in her movements that was characteristic of someone accustomed to living alone. Every morning Lydia stood in the kitchen, making no noise, just creating a warm, round atmosphere that made anyone who entered feel less lonely. Thomas, when he went out to work, always glanced toward the kitchen window, as if to make sure Lydia was still there. But Wyoming is a land of storms and unexpected events. No peace lasts forever. One afternoon, when the snow had melted and the sky opened up into a vast expanse of blue, Sheriff Cole Harding rode to the ranch. He knocked on the porch post. "Thomas, is anyone home?" Thomas came out of the stables. Lydia looked out from the kitchen. Cole did not look like the bearer of good news. His coat was dusty, and his eyes held the wariness of someone anticipating trouble. "What's wrong, Cole?" Thomas asked. Cole dismounted and approached, his voice low enough for Lydia to hear. But Lydia remained standing in the doorway, her hands on the wooden frame, her face half in the sunlight, half in the shadow of the porch. "Nathaniel Rhodes," Cole began, "went around Red Willow saying you were wasting your money on pity. He said Lydia was a burden. The ladies at church were whispering. You know how quickly that spread." Thomas stood up straight, his jaw clenched. A piece of his homeland already damaged enough over the years was hit hard by the slander. Cole continued, "He also talked about you not standing up for Lydia at the grocery store. He said you let other people hurt your wife and didn't dare say a word." Thomas gasped, as if he had been punched in the stomach. "Cole, I'm not avoiding it. I just don't want to make noise in town. I understand. But you know Wyoming people. Here, a man's silence means he's lost. Lost what he should have won." Thomas turned to look at the door. Lydia was still standing there silent, not moving, but listening to every word. The wind blew, pulling her scarf slightly to one side. Her eyes were neither blaming nor sad. Rather, they were accepting, as if she was used to the prospect of people making fun of her. Cole lowered his voice. "Thomas, listen to me. If you want to keep the peace, I won't interfere. But if you want to protect your wife, now is the time." Thomas pursed his lips. He was torn between his instinct to avoid making a scene and the feeling he was letting others decide Lydia's worth. Cole slung the reins over his shoulder. "Think about it. That's all I'm saying." Then he rode away. The kitchen door creaked in the wind as Lydia stepped out onto the porch. Thomas turned back, both confused and wanting to say something to make amends. "Lydia, Mr. Braddock," Lydia interrupted, her voice soft but firm. I can take bad words, I'm used to them. It's not what people say that makes me sad." Thomas stopped. Her eyes looked down at the broken snow. "It's that you think I need to be kept from those things." Thomas took a step forward. "It's not that I think you're weak." Lydia looked up, her eyes bright, deep, and hard as stone under the snow. "I'm not weak. I'm just tired. But I don't want to be a burden. I don't want people to be right." Thomas wanted to deny it, wanted to say she had never been a burden, but the words stuck in his throat, like all the other things he had struggled to say over the years. Lydia saw it. For a second, then she took a half step back. "I get it," she said softly. "We're all avoiding what we're afraid to face." She entered the house. The door closed, not hard, but enough to crack the fragile new peace that had formed between them. Dinner was served in silence. Each sound of fork against plate was like a gentle scratching on a nerve. Thomas tried to say something, but every time he opened his mouth, Lydia gently eased out of the conversation, answering enough but not letting it linger. She wasn't angry, just protecting her space. After dinner, Lydia washed the dishes. Thomas stood a few steps from the table, his hands clasped together. "Lydia," he said, "I don't think you're a burden. I know." Her words cut in so softly it was almost a breath. "I don't blame you." Thomas took another step. "But," Lydia turned back, handkerchief still in hand, eyes shining in the oil lamplight. "I was scared," she said. "Scared that I was walking into someone's life who wasn't ready to be with anyone else." The statement struck Thomas straight in the heart. He wanted to deny it, to insist otherwise. But what Lydia said was true. He was still afraid. Afraid to open his heart. Afraid to betray Mary's memory. Afraid to love again and lose again. But looking at Lydia, who had endured enough pain and still stood, who bore scars, not only on her face, but for a lifetime, Thomas knew something even more terrifying. To make her think she doesn't deserve to stay. That night, Thomas lay awake, and neither did Lydia. The light in her room remained on until midnight, her shadow cast on the wall like a long ripple of a woman who had lived too many years without anyone speaking her name with respect. Thomas went down to the kitchen to get a drink of water. When he returned, Lydia was also leaving the room. They stopped in the middle of the hallway, so close their breaths touched. "Can't sleep?" Lydia asked. "No," Thomas replied. "Because of what happened this afternoon?" "Because I'm scared," he said softly. Lydia looked up. "What are you afraid of?" Thomas took a deep breath. It had been a long time since he had said something so difficult. "I was afraid of hurting her without realizing I was doing it." Lydia looked at him for a long moment. Then her face softened slightly, slowly, but clearly. "Thomas," she said his name for the first time in a warm voice, "you didn't hurt me. It's just, I need to know if you want me here, for me, or out of duty." Thomas felt his chest tighten. "Lydia." But before he had finished speaking, a noise was heard in the yard. The sound of a fence being beaten by the wind, and the sound of horse hooves trampling in the snow. Both were startled. Thomas walked toward the door. Lydia followed. A figure on horseback passed in front of the ranch, the moonlight illuminating his tall figure, black coat, wide hat, and half smile. Nathaniel Rhodes. He stopped, looking straight at Thomas's house, his eyes cold as if to give a warning. No words needed, no dismounting needed. Just that look was enough for Thomas to understand that Nathaniel had no intention of leaving their lives. And Lydia, seeing him in the moonlight, shuddered, not because she was afraid of him, but because she was afraid that Thomas's silence in town might be the reason Nathaniel would openly hurt her again. Thomas stepped onto the porch, standing straight, his eyes cold. Nathaniel curled his lips, then turned his horse and rode away, leaving deep tracks in the snow. When Thomas returned, Lydia was standing very still. Her eyes said something she could not say. "Will you stand by me when needed?" Thomas didn't answer, but silence was no longer avoidance. But it was a promise in the making, unspoken, but already beating in his heart. And Lydia for once didn't turn away. She looked at Thomas expectantly, without fear, without retreat. Two people, Two fears, two pains, are getting closer to the point of no return. The next morning was darker than usual. Low, gray clouds hung low, pulling the sky down to the ground. The snow from the night before had hardened into crusts that cracked softly under Thomas's feet as he walked to the stables. He checked each cage. Old Oak shook his mane, and shiny Black Bell nudged his sleeve as if seeking warmth. Thomas stroked her mane and took deep breaths of the biting air. But his heart was not focused on the work. The image of Nathaniel riding around the ranch last night flashed through his mind like a black mark, and Lydia's eyes not accusing, not afraid, but waiting. A kind of waiting that makes him feel like he's standing between two worlds. One side is the habit of being silent for many years. The other side is a woman who has suffered so much pain and just wants someone to stand by her side for once. Thomas wiped his hands on his pants, trying to push the thoughts away. But the harder he tried, the tighter they clung. Inside, Lydia was making breakfast. She stirred the oatmeal, steam rising from the pot, fogging her eyes. She hadn't slept well last night. Not because of Nathaniel, but because of the way Thomas had stood silently watching him. She didn't want to doubt him. But someone who had been abandoned so many times, it was hard not to think the worst. Lydia wrapped the scarf neatly around her neck, hiding a few scars. The gesture was unconscious, a reflex of someone used to feeling hundreds of scrutinies. The door opened. Thomas walked in, brushing snow off his shoulders. Lydia smiled slightly. "Are you done?" Almost there," Thomas replied, hanging his hat on a nail. "It was colder than I thought this morning. Do you need anything to make lunch again?" Thomas looked at her for a few seconds, a longer look than usual. "Lydia, did I upset you last night?" Lydia's hand paused on the pot handle. She didn't turn away immediately, as if considering how to answer without offending him. "No," she said softly. "It's just that I understand you have your reasons for being silent." Thomas took a step closer. "But I don't want you to think I'm silent because I'm ashamed of you." Lydia looked over. Her good eyes glistened under the steam rising from the pot. "I don't think so." But her voice was uncertain. "You don't need to do anything heavy today," Thomas said as they sat down to breakfast. "There's a wind forecast. I'm not fragile," Lydia replied softly. Not harshly, but not backing down either. "You don't have to worry about that." "I'm not worried because I think you're weak," Thomas said quietly. "I'm worried because I want you to be okay." The atmosphere in the house became still for a moment. The sound of the spoon hitting the bowl was like a pin dropping. Lydia put down her spoon. "Mr. Thomas," her voice trembled slightly more than before. "I was with the one who always protected me, until he saw my face in the light. Then he left." Thomas frowned. This was the first time she had mentioned him to herself. "He left her because of the scars?" Lydia nodded slowly. "Not right away. But he began to fear what people would see. Fear of what they would say. Fear of what they would think he had made the wrong choice." Thomas gripped the edge of the table. "Lydia, I'm not like him." "Maybe," she said, her voice light as the wind. "But sometimes other people's fears are more frightening than our own." In the afternoon, Lydia hung the clothes out to dry behind the house. The sun was dull, and the wind blew in gusts, lifting the flaps of her clothes. Thomas saw from a distance that she was struggling to stick the clothesline into the hard ice. He hurried over. "Let me help." "No need. I can do it," Lydia said, but didn't stop him. Thomas held the stake for her, and together they drove it into the ground. When it was secure, Lydia straightened, her hand lightly touching the edge of her apron. She looked at him as if she wanted to say something, but didn't know where to start. Finally, Lydia said, very softly, "Mr. Braddock, have you ever loved anyone since Mary?" The question struck Thomas like a cold wind. He tried to take a deep breath. "Or not? Because you are afraid of betraying the past?" Thomas looked down at the ground, where thin patches of snow melted into water. "Because I think I've lost the best part of my life. I don't want to love anymore." Lydia was speechless. Not at the answer, but at the honesty in his voice, something she hadn't expected from someone like Thomas. "But," Thomas continued, his voice slow and heavy. You came, and I realized there were things I had locked up that I shouldn't have. At that moment, Lydia turned away. As if she was afraid his eyes would read the turmoil in her heart. I don't want to be a burden, she whispered. Lydia, Thomas called, his voice firm. She stopped, not turning around, but standing still to listen. You're not a burden, he said. The only thing that bothers me is that I'm afraid I'm not good enough for you. Lydia turned back, and for the first time, her expression wasn't wary or grateful, but genuinely touched. You think you're not good enough? She asked. Thomas nodded slightly. I've lived as a shadow for too long. Someone like you deserves more than someone learning to open up again. Lydia smiled, a sad yet strangely beautiful smile. Thomas, someone who was once abandoned like me, just needs someone to stand by him without turning away. Nothing more. He wanted to say he would stand by. He wanted to say he wouldn't turn away. He wanted to say the things his heart had kept hidden for so many years. But just then, the sound of horse hooves echoed at the front gate of the ranch. They both turned back at the same time. A man rode in on horseback, not Nathaniel, not anyone in town. Lydia stared. Some old, distant memory seemed to resurface. Thomas stepped forward, standing like a wall between Lydia and the stranger. The man stopped his horse a few paces away from them and pulled down his scarf. His voice rang out, hoarse and cold. Lydia Harrow? Lydia turned pale. Her hands turned white as she clutched the hem of her dress. No, it can't be. Thomas looked over, worried. Do you know him? Lydia didn't answer. Her eyes widened and she trembled for the first time since arriving at the ranch. The man curled his lips. I've been looking for you for 2 years. His gaze fixed on Lydia's scarred half-face like a threat, and his voice fell upon the ranch like darkness. It's time for you to come back and pay your debt. Thomas stood in front of Lydia immediately. The fear in Lydia's heart, which had been dormant, flared up. A new crack, deep, strong, made the whole ranch hold its breath. The evening wind swept across the fields, carrying the snow like a thin mist along the ground. The sky was gray, blocking out the last rays of sunlight. Thomas stood in front of Lydia, his body as stiff as an old pine tree in a storm. The strange man on horseback, tall, thin, eyes as sharp as a long sharpened knife, looked at them both with undisguised coldness. Lydia Harrow, he repeated, slowly and clearly, as if each word were a drill bit driven into the ground. Lydia took a step back. Her hands clenched the hem of her coat, shaking slightly. Who are you? Thomas asked, his voice low but authoritative. The man didn't look at Thomas, but looked past him, toward Lydia. You won't tell your new husband? You won't tell him what you left behind? Enough, Thomas said, his voice low. I asked who you are. The man pulled on the reins, causing the horse to back up half a step. My name is Victor Hale. The name made Lydia stop. Her eyes widened, panic evident, fear not because of the danger ahead, but because the past had found its way back. Thomas noticed, standing even more firmly. Victor. Lydia breathed, her voice shaking like an overstretched string. I thought you had left. He let out a short, sharp laugh. I left. But you left me with a mess bigger than any debt. Thomas frowned. What debt? Lydia doesn't owe anyone anything. Victor tilted his head at him, a half smile on his face. Are you sure? What do you know about your new wife? Lydia took another half step back. Thomas immediately followed to block Victor from getting closer. Don't say anything more, Lydia cut in, her voice choked. Victor stared at her. You ran away from me. You left the orphanage I built. You left when you were needed most. You left when the house burned down, and left me standing alone. Thomas stopped. Lydia paled. I didn't abandon anyone, Lydia said, her voice cracking like glass. I saved a child. Save? Victor laughed out loud. You call that saving? You spilled a bucket of acid. You hurt the child. You ruined my work. Lydia shuddered. No. Victor, I don't. He's lying, Thomas interrupted, his voice firm. But Lydia couldn't speak. Old wounds not on her face, but in her heart, Bleed it again. Victor turned to Thomas, his voice bitter. You are lucky. You married a woman who always brings trouble with her. Thomas stepped forward, standing only a few feet from the horse's head. Get off my ranch. Oh? Victor tilted his head. I came to take her home. She has a debt to pay to me, to the children. Lydia shook her head vigorously, her hands raised as if to push away the memory. I didn't burn down the orphanage. Not me. Victor didn't listen, or didn't want to listen. Thomas, Lydia said, her voice almost breaking, please don't interfere. This. No, Thomas said immediately, turning to Lydia. You're not alone anymore. Lydia looked up, her eyes filled with tears but not weak tears. The kind of tears that come from a lifetime of blame, and suddenly someone standing beside her. Thomas turned back to Victor. Do you have documents? Proof? Or are you just here to blame the woman you abandoned? Victor curled his lips. You know nothing about that. I know enough to know she is not the type to do anything despicable, Thomas replied. Victor was suddenly silent for a second, his expression stiffened slightly. He clearly hadn't expected Thomas to say that. But then he chuckled. You think she is innocent? Look at her face. It is the face of a disaster. Lydia recoiled, as if struck. Shame and self-reproach filled her eyes. Thomas heard that, and his whole body felt like it was on fire. He walked straight up to Victor, standing close to his horse. Enough, Thomas said lowly, but his voice carried the weight of a man from the West who had suffered too much loss to fear more pain. Victor tilted his head slightly. What are you going to do? Thomas didn't shout, didn't threaten, just spoke each word clearly. If you say one more word against Lydia Harrow, I will have you banished from Red Willow ever again. The whole atmosphere around the ranch fell silent for a second. Victor looked straight at Thomas, his eyes no longer contemptuous, but wary. He knew Thomas Braddock was no talker. The wind began to blow harder. Lydia hugged her sleeves, her hands shaking. But her eyes looked at Thomas as if she were looking at a wall she had always wanted someone to build for her. Victor finally pulled on the reins and turned the horse. All right. I'll be back. And next time, I'll bring papers. She won't get away. He rode away, leaving a trail of churned snow and a heavy atmosphere over the ranch. When Victor had disappeared behind the distant snowy hills, Lydia stood near the door, her hands shaking so much she had to hold on to the door frame. Thomas stepped forward. Lydia, you shouldn't say that. She trembled. Victor. He won't let it go. I don't care about him. I care. Lydia said, louder than usual, her voice choked, as if an iron door had just been flung open. I have caused too much trouble for those who once trusted me. I don't want to do it to you anymore. Thomas looked at her a long time, not the look of someone who wanted to persuade, but of someone who understood a fear that ran deep into the bones. Lydia, he said softly but firmly, you are not causing trouble. You are just carrying things you have had to carry alone for too long. Lydia breathed heavily, as if trying to keep herself from breaking. Thomas, I'm scared, she said honestly. Scared that one day you'll look at me the way Victor looks at me. The way Nathaniel looks at me. The way everyone else looked at me. Thomas shook his head. Then he did something he never did before, placed his hand on her shoulder, gently. Lydia Harrow, he said slowly. I only saw a woman who survived more than a whole team of men could endure. Lydia clutched the edge of her shirt, tears falling down her scarred skin, but this time, not from humiliation, but because someone believes her. Thomas added, his voice choked but firm, and I won't let anyone touch you, in any way that will hurt you anymore. Lydia looked at him, a look full of weariness, full of confusion, but also filled with a small glimmer of light that she dared not yet acknowledge. You say that. I don't know what to believe. You don't have to believe it right away, Thomas replied. Just know. I'm here. The wind blew harder, but not enough to shake the silence that was growing between them, a warm, hopeful silence. The sky over Red Willow was unusually black that evening, not the pitch black of a blizzard, nor the sharp chill that made one shiver. It was the kind of darkness that was so heavy it seemed to swallow even the sound of one's breath. In the small kitchen, The light of an oil lamp illuminated the old wood grain. Thomas stood at the table, his hands resting on the rough wood. His back was slightly hunched, not from fatigue, but from the fact that his mind was delving into too many things at once. Victor Hale, the accusation, Lydia's trembling eyes, the fear in his own heart. He hadn't said anything since Victor had left. Not because silence was easy, but because he knew that if he said the wrong thing, Lydia would close her heart, and he didn't want to lose what was beginning to form between them. In the corner of the kitchen, Lydia sat by the fireplace, her arms wrapped tightly around her shawl. She wasn't crying, but her shoulders were shaking. The heat from the stove couldn't dispel the chill of the memories she had to face again. After a while, Lydia said, very softly, "Mr. Braddock, this is going to get more complicated." Thomas turned back. "Don't call me Mr. Braddock anymore." Lydia raised her head. "So, what should I call you?" Thomas moved closer and sat down on the chair next to her. His voice was low, but warm. "Call me Thomas, like last night." Lydia was startled. She remembered that night clearly, the first time she called him by his name. The first time he said what he had kept hidden in his heart for so many years. "Thomas," she repeated. His name trembled in her voice like the sound of a dry leaf against glass. Thomas took a deep breath. "Now tell me, Victor Hale, who is he to you?" Lydia looked into the fire, the light dancing on her scars, making them softer. "Victor was the head of a children's home in Missouri. I was a nurse there during the war. The home was poor. There was a lack of medicine, a lack of people, and a lack of protection." She stopped, her hands clenched into fists. "You know, when a place is poor, it easily becomes a place where people abandon unwanted children." Thomas nodded. He understood. In the West, anything poor was easily overlooked, even human life. "Victor is the manager," Lydia continued. "He is smart, resourceful, and very good at convincing people to thank him. But inside, he rules by fear." Thomas frowned. "What did he do to you?" Lydia was silent for a long time. The wind outside the window blew loudly, winter's way of reminding people that there were things that were not easy to breathe out. "He uses me to do everything," Lydia said. "Medical care, cooking, cleaning, and then child care. And when I protest, he starts blaming." Thomas gritted his teeth. He could see Lydia choosing her words carefully so as not to make herself tremble more. "Then what happened?" Thomas asked. Lydia looked down at her hands. "That day, a stranger broke in. He tried to steal medicine and donations. I tried to shield the child from me. He threw the acid at him." Thomas inhaled sharply, his eyes darkening. "And she midwifed it," Thomas said, as if to confirm what he believed. Lydia nodded. "The acid hit me, but some of it hit the oil lamp. It fell. The fire spread fast, too fast." Her voice became small. "At that time, Victor wasn't there. But when he returned, he immediately blamed me. Blamed me for being careless. And when he reported to the authorities, he wrote that I started the fire." Thomas stood up, anger rising like a fire from the stove. He blamed everything on her just to preserve his reputation. Lydia did not deny it. She just closed her eyes, as if remembering the face of a child who was no longer there. "I left," Lydia said softly. "There was no place for me there. The foster mothers saw me as a monster. Victor saw me as a burden. I was afraid. If I stayed, they would continue to die." Thomas knelt before Lydia, something he rarely did with anyone. "Lydia," he said slowly, word by word, "you didn't do anything. You saved someone. He's the one who put children in danger." Lydia opened her eyes and looked at him with the desolation of someone who has long been used to hearing herself accused. "Thomas, if Victor comes back with the papers, with the unfinished evidence, you'll be dragged into this. Your ranch, your reputation, the normal life you're trying to keep." Thomas looked deep into her eyes. His voice was low but firm. "Lydia Harrow, I will not live again if it is only to maintain a false peace." She bit her lip. A drop of water fell onto her sleeve, like snow melting on stone. "You don't have to run away," Thomas said. Not here. As evening approached, Lydia stepped out onto the porch. The wind was cold, but the sky was full of stars. Hundreds of tiny stars hung like hanging lanterns, illuminating the vast silver field. Thomas stood on the opposite porch, checking the oil lamppost. "Mr. Thomas," Lydia called softly. Thomas turned back. "Huh? You—" She stopped mid-sentence, as if afraid the word would go too far. "Do you regret it? For saying those things in front of Victor?" Thomas approached, his steps heavy but sure. "If I don't," he replied, "I'll regret it. But Victor will come back. I know. And Nathaniel will definitely take this opportunity. I know too." Lydia looked at him longer than usual. "Then why do you keep talking? As if I'm worth protecting." Thomas hesitated for a second, his heart beating faster. Then he spoke slowly, speaking honestly. "Because I see you, and I see myself in you." Lydia tilted her head slightly, her eyes softening. "We both," said Thomas, "are people who have lived a long time, as if love were something only for other people." Lydia bit her lip, trying to keep her voice steady. "Thomas, I don't know if I can believe it again." "If you don't believe me yet," he whispered, "let me go with you until you do." Lydia let out a short sigh, half tired, half relieved, as if someone had just untied a knot in her heart that she didn't dare untie herself. "Thomas." "Yes? If this leads to trouble, I'll leave. I won't let you trade the ranch for me." Thomas frowned, stepping forward until he was only a small distance away from her. "Lydia Harrow, if you step off this ranch, that would be real trouble." That sentence made Lydia stunned. The wind blew, pulling her scarf aside, revealing the scar that ran down her neck. Thomas didn't look away. He stared straight ahead, no pity, no avoidance, just the pure recognition of someone who sees another person for what they are, not for what they look like. "You being here," he said, "is the best thing that's happened to this ranch in many years." Lydia clenched her hands in her scarf, her eyes sparkling but deep. "Thomas, you say it as if—" Thomas interrupted, his voice soft but warm enough to slow down the wind. "Like I care about you more than you think." At that moment, Lydia opened her mouth to say something, but her voice caught in her throat. The wind blew across the porch. The stars trembled slightly, as if holding their breath for both of them. Lydia turned away before her heart could speak for itself. "Thank you," she said, stepping into the house, her hands shaking more from emotion than from cold. The door closed behind her, but Thomas knew this was not a door closed to keep out the world, but it is the door that opens to the truth that the two can no longer avoid. Even if Victor comes back, even if Nathaniel plots, even if the past brings back shadows, one thing is certain: Thomas Braddock would not let Lydia Harrow stand alone again. Not again. The next morning, a mist covered the Red Willow Valley like a heavy white blanket. The distant pines were barely visible. There was only the smell of wet earth after the melting snow and the clopping of horses from the stables. Inside, Lydia woke early. She had not been able to sleep, despite Thomas's reassuring words the night before. They had been so gentle that she feared she was expecting too much. Waiting is the most painful thing, Lydia thought, her hands unconsciously clutching the edge of the blanket. She wrapped herself in a shawl and walked into the kitchen. The cold air hit her face, causing the scar on her cheek to prickle in warning. But Lydia ignored it. She was used to the pain, both physical and mental. As the water in the pot boiled and the wood in the stove crackled, she began to prepare breakfast. But her hands were restless. They trembled slightly, as if asking, "Is what happened yesterday real? Is there really anyone on my side?" The door opened. Thomas entered early, his coat still damp with dew. "You're up earlier than usual," he said, his voice low and even. "I couldn't sleep," Lydia replied, without turning around. Thomas put his hat on the table. "For Victor?" Lydia laughed softly, a forced laugh. "Not exactly, because I thought about what you said last night." Thomas stood behind her for a moment, not touching, but close enough for Lydia to feel his warmth. "And you worry?" he asked. Lydia nodded. "Worried that I misunderstood. Worried that I shouldn't." let myself be influenced by such gentle words." Thomas was silent for a few seconds and then said, "Lydia Harrow, I'm not one to say things I don't mean." Lydia turned back, her eyes slightly red. "But sometimes good intentions can't overcome reality." Thomas looked at her for a long time. "We will face reality together," he replied. The thin smile at the corner of Lydia's lips softened, not the smile of someone who was no longer afraid, but of someone who felt somewhat relieved. At noon, Sheriff Cole Harding arrived. His horse was covered in mud, and his face was as taut as a bowstring. Thomas met him in the yard. "What's the matter?" Thomas asked. Cole got off his horse, took off his gloves, and said in a low voice, "I heard Victor Hale asking the townspeople about Lydia. He even questioned Attorney Baker. This can't be good." Thomas clenched his fists. "He wants false evidence." Cole didn't deny it. "Victor isn't the type to give up when he feels like he's lost. I know him, I've met him a few times. He's smart, and he knows how to ask questions that scare people." Thomas looked over to the kitchen window, where Lydia was standing looking out, but trying to appear to be washing dishes. "Cole," Thomas said, "if he comes back, I know," Cole interrupted, "and I'll stand behind you. But, Thomas, this isn't just a threat. If he files a lawsuit, Lydia could be forced to return to Missouri to investigate." The words were like a heavy hoe blow to the peaceful soil of the ranch. Thomas spun around. "No. Lydia isn't going anywhere." Cole sighed. "I'm just saying so you can prepare." Thomas clenched his teeth so hard, his jaw jerked. "You care about her that much?" Cole asked, his voice sincere. Thomas didn't answer. But the look he gave the house at the woman he hadn't yet dared admit, his heart was growing dependent on her. Every breath was enough for Cole to understand. In the kitchen, Lydia looked out the window and saw Thomas and Cole talking. Even though she couldn't hear clearly, she knew what they were saying was not good. A shadow of worry crossed her face. "I brought him trouble, just like everyone else before me." The thought crept up, gnawing at his nascent faith. When Thomas walked in, Lydia was wiping the table, trying to look normal. "Lydia," Thomas said. "Yes?" Cole said Victor was digging up some dirt in town. Lydia held her breath. "What did he say about me?" "Nothing bad," Thomas replied, "but something might happen." Lydia put the towel down. "Thomas, you don't need to drag yourself into this. I can take care of myself." "No," Thomas said, his voice so forceful it made Lydia pause. "I've let too many things slip away in silence. Not this time." Lydia looked at him, her eyes bright but trembling. "Thomas, if Victor sues me, you'll be dragged in. Your reputation, your ranch." "Lydia Harrow," Thomas said slowly, "fame feeds no one, but being on the right side of those who need you feeds you." Lydia shielded her eyes with her hands. She wanted to be strong, but Thomas's steadfast kindness wore her shell thin. "I don't deserve this," she whispered. "You are worthy," Thomas said immediately, "and I will say it every day until you believe it." Late in the afternoon, Lydia went to the back of the house to get water. The cold air turned her breath into thin clouds. As she bent down to the well, she heard footsteps behind her. Lydia turned around, startled. Nathaniel Rhodes stood there, not as arrogant as last time, but his eyes contained something darker and colder. "Mrs. Harrow," he said, his voice low and sharp, "I saw Victor come in here this morning. He doesn't look like the type to give up." Lydia stood up straight, clutching her sleeve. "What do you want?" Nathaniel shrugged. "I just came to warn you. He and I used to do business together. I know the kind of man he is. When he wants to drag someone down, he will." Lydia swallowed. "Are you saying that to scare me?" Nathaniel tilted his head. "No. I'm telling you. Once Thomas protects you, he'll be dragged down with him." Lydia paled. "Are you expecting that to happen?" she asked. Nathaniel gave a short laugh. "I expect nothing. But I know the simple truth. Women like you always make men pay." The words were like a thorn in Lydia's heart. She wanted to remain calm, but her eyes were trembling. Nathaniel stepped closer, his voice low. "And you know what's funny? The more Thomas protects you, the more he loses." Lydia backed away, her feet touching the well wall. Just then, Thomas's voice rang out from afar. "Nathaniel!" He turned back, the smile gone. Thomas walked quickly forward, his eyes sharp as icebergs on the river. "Get off my ranch," Thomas said. Nathaniel looked at Lydia, then back at Thomas. "I'm just warning you. You'd better listen." Thomas didn't move. "Last time, go away." Nathaniel took a deep breath through his teeth, then turned his horse. But before he left, he said something that made both Lydia and Thomas freeze. "Be careful, Braddock. Sometimes protecting the wrong person can cost you more than you gain." Then he rode away, leaving behind a cloud of snow. When he was gone, Lydia turned to Thomas, her face paler than when she had seen Victor. "Thomas, you see? I got you into trouble. Nathaniel was right. Thomas reached out and touched her shoulder. "No, he's wrong." "But, Lydia," Thomas said, his voice soft but firm, "you have the right to stand next to someone without having to apologize for your existence." Lydia's eyelashes fluttered slightly. "You're not a burden," Thomas continued. "Not a problem, not a problem. You're a survivor, and that's worth standing next to." Lydia swallowed hard, her eyes glistening. "Thomas, don't be too nice to me. I'm afraid I can't pay you back." "You don't have to pay," Thomas replied. "Just stay." The evening wind blew across the porch. In that moment, Lydia did not retreat any further. She stood there, not stronger, but truer. Weak, but not running away. And Thomas felt it. This was the first time Lydia had stood still, letting someone else shield her. That evening, the wind rose from the northern hills. It roared through the stable roof, sending dry pine needles whirling across the snow. In the sky, long streaks of cloud tore across the moon, as if someone had draped a blanket over a lamp. Thomas felt the wind even as he closed the barn door. He had grown accustomed to the Wyoming wind, but tonight it carried a different scent. A scent not of earth and snow, but of unease. Inside, Lydia sat in a chair near the fireplace, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the window. What Nathaniel had said that afternoon still echoed in her mind. "Protecting the wrong person will cost you more than you gain." The words stung like needles, leaving Lydia breathless. She knew the words were mean, but that didn't mean they were completely wrong. Lydia's life had been filled with too many storms she hadn't meant to create. When Thomas entered the house, Lydia immediately stood up. "You're home," she said, her voice as light as the wind coming through the crack in the door. Thomas hung his hat on a nail and looked at her. "You're thinking too much again." Lydia crouched down, her hands clenched. "I don't want you to lose the ranch. I don't want you dragged into my mess." Thomas moved closer. The distance was only a few steps. "Lydia, this ranch has withstood 2 wildfires, 4 bitter winters, and the greatest loss of my life. You are not what makes it falter." Lydia wanted to believe. Really did. But she shook her head. "Thomas, I'm not as strong as you think." "No one stays strong forever," Thomas replied, his voice warm but forceful. "But you have survived things no one should have to. That is strong enough." Lydia took a deep breath, like someone trying to fight against the ice in her heart, slowly melting. But before she could say anything, a loud noise came from outside in the yard. Both were startled. The sound of hooves. Not just one but many. Thomas walked to the window and pulled the curtain slightly. Lanterns swayed from the ranch gate. 3 men rode, their cloaks dark and their hoods low. The wind was strong, and their shadows trailed the lanterns in long black streaks. Lydia paled. "Thomas, that is." "I know," Thomas said softly. He took the chandelier and walked out onto the porch. Lydia followed but stopped just inside the doorway. 3 men stopped their horses. The one in the lead was Victor Hale. The 2 behind him were not Nathaniel, but 2 strangers, large men, their faces either threatening or expressionless. Victor dismounted, his eyes sharp as a wet knife in the night. "Braddock," he said, "I came as promised." Thomas stood on the steps, a little higher but not enough to cover Lydia's position behind him. "What do you bring here?" Thomas asked calmly. Victor held out a sheaf of papers. A petition to have Lydia Harrow sent back to Missouri for investigation. Without a court, no one can judge who is right. I just did what had to be done. Lydia heard that. Her spine turned cold. Thomas clenched his fists. You have no authority to force anyone to leave this state, Thomas said. Victor smiled. I don't force her. I demand. And if she refuses, I'll let the whole country know she caused the deaths of 2 children in Missouri. Lydia blurted out. No. I don't. Shut up, Victor shouted. Thomas stepped down a step, his voice dropping like a rolling stone. No one yells at Lydia here. Victor shrugged. I'm just telling the truth. Those 2 children died in the fire. And the acid at the scene shows. The acid I saved a child from, Lydia said more forcefully, reacting for the first time not out of fear but out of frustration with the lie. Victor looked straight at Lydia. You mean you're innocent? No one at the camp believes you're innocent. Lydia trembled, but straightened her shoulders. No one wants to believe it because everyone needs an excuse to leave a place full of suffering. Victor was silent for a second, not because he was embarrassed, but because he hadn't expected Lydia to look at him so directly. Thomas stood next to Lydia and said, You don't bring the truth here, Victor Hale. You only bring your ego. Victor narrowed his eyes. The 2 men behind him moved their horses forward a little. Braddock, Victor said slowly, I don't want to cause you any trouble. But if you continue to harbor a woman who has committed a crime— She did not commit a crime, Thomas interrupted. Victor sneered. Then, let the court judge. Lydia lightly touched Thomas's arm, a natural but urgent gesture. Thomas, let me go, she said softly. But the wind carried her words to him as clearly as thunder. Thomas turned, surprised. Lydia, let me go, she repeated. If I stay here, you will lose everything. Thomas shook his head vigorously. No, I'm not letting you walk off this ranch with him. Victor sighed. Braddock, don't make it difficult. Thomas looked straight at Victor, his voice as firm as rock. If anyone walked, it was you, not Lydia. Victor signaled to the 2 men behind him. One of them dismounted and took a few steps forward. Lydia clenched her sleeves until they turned white. Thomas stood up 1 step like a rock blocking the wind. Enough, Thomas said. Lydia isn't going anywhere. Victor frowned, his voice becoming colder. Braddock, you know I can have people saying bad things about town. Your reputation will be in jeopardy if people think you're protecting criminals. Thomas shouted for the first time. I told you she's innocent. Victor laughed, a sound as sharp as glass. Are you in love with her? The question fell through the air. Heavy, sharp as an arrow, hitting Thomas where he best hit it. Thomas opened his mouth, but Lydia took a step forward before he could reply. Victor, she said, her voice trembling but clear, you can no longer use fear to control me. Victor looked at her, his eyes flashing with surprise and anger. Do you think you're stronger because you have someone to shield you? He said. No, Lydia replied. I am stronger because I am not hiding anymore. The wind whipped the chandelier, making it flicker. You can't take me away from here, Lydia continued, her hand still touching Thomas lightly as if seeking support, because for the first time in years, I have someone who believes in me. Thomas took a deep breath, emotion pounding in his chest like the kick of a wild horse. Victor jerked the reins, his eyes darkening. You 2 want to make things difficult for me? He said. Thomas tried to keep his voice calm. Victor, leave here, before you cause something you dare not take responsibility for. Victor pursed his lips. Fine, he said, but I'll be back, with papers, with the law, with everything I've got. He turned his horse and kicked it hard in the belly. The sound of hooves faded away, dragging the other 2 men with it. Only the wind blew fiercely, and darkness spread across the ranch yard. Lydia nearly collapsed when Victor was out of sight. Thomas reached out to support her. Lydia, are you okay? She shook her head, but not with fear, with emotion. Thomas, she whispered, why don't you let me go? You'll lose the ranch, lose your reputation, lose everything. Thomas bent down and looked deep into her eyes. Lydia Harrow, he said slowly, if I let you walk away tonight, it would be the loss of everything. Lydia shivered not from the cold this time, but because the words struck at the deepest part of her loneliness. Thomas. I don't know how I can respond to how you feel. Thomas shook his head. You don't have to say anything in return. Just give me the chance to protect you. Not because I have to, not because of the rules, because I want to. Lydia breathed heavily, her breath mixed with tears. In the flickering light of the oil lamp, her scarred face seemed to be covered with a new layer of light, not hidden, but viewed with respect. Thomas. She called his name, her voice breaking like someone who had just crossed a cold river and touched warm land. I will stay. Thomas closed his eyes for a second. The words were warmer to him than the fire in the hearth. Thomas and Lydia's story reminds us that at any age, people need to be understood, to be seen without judgment. The wounds of life, whether they be on the face or in the soul, can be healed when someone is patient and kind enough to stay. For those who have gone through most of their lives, this story is a gentle reminder. Love is never too late. Loneliness is not the end. And sometimes, opening your heart once more is a gift you give yourself, not to forget the past, but to see that you are still valuable, still loved, and can still start over. If you have ever experienced loss, feared rebirth, or thought your heart was asleep, I hope this story brings you some warmth. Thank you for listening. If the story touches you, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel to continue accompanying humane journeys like this.